Paula settled into her cozy apartment in Mexico City, a sanctuary adorned with horror memorabilia that brought her comfort amidst the chaos of urban life. Posters of classic horror films lined the walls, and shelves were filled with figurines of iconic monsters. She loved the thrill of horror. It was her passion, her escape. As she curled up on her soft, worn-out couch, wrapped in a blanket with a mug of hot chocolate in hand, she felt safe. The world outside faded away, and for a moment, she could immerse herself in the fictional terrors that she adored. As the night deepened, the city lights flickered through her window like distant stars. The sounds of the bustling streets below were muffled, and Paula lost herself in a movie marathon, her heart racing with every jump scare. But soon, her tranquility was shattered. A soft ping from her phone pierced the silence. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she read the anonymous message, "I see you." Accompanying the text was a chilling photo taken from a distance, capturing her silhouette staring out of her window, oblivious to the lurking threat. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly glanced around her apartment, her mind racing. Who could have sent this? Was someone watching her? The comfortable atmosphere she had created began to feel suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She stood up, her thoughts spiraling into a vortex of fear and paranoia. After pacing the room, she grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend Diego. "Diego, I need to talk to you. Something strange happened," she stammered when he picked up. "Hey Paula, what's going on?" Diego's voice was warm and reassuring, a contrast to the cold fear gripping her. "I received a message, an anonymous message. It said, 'I see you,' and there's a photo. I think someone is watching me," she confessed, her voice trembling. Hey, calm down. You're safe in your apartment, right? It's probably just some prank." "You know how people are," Diego replied, trying to ease her worries. "You can always rely on me. I'll come over right now." Paula felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Diego. I don't know what to think. It's creeping me out." "Don't worry, I'll be there in 10, he assured her before hanging up. As she waited for Diego, Paula's mind raced with thoughts of who could be behind the message. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the darkness. The city seemed to pulse with life, yet she felt entirely alone. When Diego finally arrived, he burst through the door, his presence a comforting balm against her rising anxiety. "Show me the message," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. Paula handed him her phone, her hands shaking slightly. He examined the screen, his expression shifting from worry to disbelief. "Okay, this is definitely unsettling," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But let's not panic. You have to be careful, though. You don't want this to consume you." "I know, but it feels so real. What if it's someone I know? What if they want to hurt me?" Paula's voice wavered, the fear creeping back in. Diego stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll stay with you tonight. We'll figure this out together. You're not alone in this." His words wrapped around her like a protective shield, calming her racing heart. "Thank you, Diego. I don't know what I would do without you," she whispered, feeling the weight of her fear lift slightly. As they settled onto the couch, Diego switched on the TV, and the familiar sounds of horror films filled the room once more. But even as they laughed at the absurdity of the characters' choices, the unease lingered in the air. Paula couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. The warm glow of the television flickered, casting shadows that danced eerily across the walls, reminding her that sometimes the real horror was not in the movies, but in the unpredictability of life itself. As the days dragged on, the unsettling messages continued to invade Paula's sanctuary, each one more distressing than the last. What had begun as a single, chilling photograph had now morphed into a series of intrusive snapshots and cryptic texts that stripped away her sense of safety. She would wake up each morning to find her phone buzzing with notifications that sent her heart racing. "I see you, Paula. You look beautiful when you're lost in thought," read one message, accompanied by a picture of her, taken from the alley behind her building. Colors drained from her face as she stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. "Diego," she said one afternoon, after yet another sleepless night filled with paranoia. They sat on her worn-out couch, the flickering light from the horror movie they had started to watch casting uneasy shadows around the room. "I'm really scared. It feels like someone is watching me." Diego turned to her, his expression a mix of concern and something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite place. "You know you can always count on me, right? I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe," he replied, his voice thick with intensity. "We can report it to the police if you want." Paula shook her head. "I don't want to make a big deal out of it. What if it's nothing? It could just be a prank, right?" But even as she said the words, the doubt gnawed at her insides. She could feel Diego's eyes on her, studying her with an intensity that made her uneasy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she glanced out her window, hoping to find solace in the familiar view of the bustling street below. Instead, her gaze fell upon a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlight. Her heart raced, and she squinted, trying to discern whether it was merely her imagination playing tricks on her. "Diego, do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He leaned closer to the window, his breath hot against her neck. "See what?" he asked, feigning nonchalance. "It's just the night, Paula. You're letting your mind play tricks on you." But deep down, she felt the creeping tendrils of fear wrap around her heart. She started to notice other odd behaviors from Diego, like the way he seemed to memorize her daily routines. "What time do you usually leave for work?" he would ask, his tone casual yet probing. "And what's your plan for the weekend? Any big plans?" "Why do you want to know?" she would reply, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's just a weekend." He would laugh, a little too loudly, a little too forced. "Just making sure you're safe, you know? I want to be there if you need anything." Paula's instinct told her something was off. The warmth that once surrounded her friendship with Diego felt suffocating now, like a blanket pulled too tight. She felt trapped, as if the very walls of her apartment were closing in on her. One evening, as she sat curled up on the couch, scrolling through her social media feed, a notification popped up, a new message from her unknown tormentor. "I'm always close to you, always watching." Her heart plummeted. The walls felt like they were closing in, and she struggled to breathe. "Paula, you okay?" Diego's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. She looked up to find him standing in her doorway, an anxious expression on his face. The shadows in the room deepened, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark. "Yeah, just tired," she lied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I think I need to start locking the door at night." "Locking the door? You think that will help?" His tone was light, but the underlying tension was palpable. "You really should let me stay over just in case." Paula hesitated. The offer should have sounded comforting, but instead it felt like another layer of control, another way for him to insert himself into her life. "I'll be fine, Diego. I appreciate it, really, but I need to handle this myself." As the sun set and darkness enveloped the city, Paula felt the weight of her fear settle heavily on her chest. She glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the shadow from before, but it was gone, leaving only an unsettling emptiness in its wake. With each passing day, her paranoia grew, wrapping around her thoughts like a vice. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was not just being watched, but hunted. And in the back of her mind, a dreadful thought began to take root. What if the real danger was closer than she imagined? Paula sat cross-legged on her living room floor, the soft glow of her horror-themed lamps casting eerie shadows on the walls. She stared at the empty space on her wall where she had hoped to hang her new security camera. The decision to install them felt like a desperate measure, but with the constant barrage of unsettling messages, it seemed the only way to reclaim a sense of safety. As she rummaged through the packaging, her mind wandered to the chilling photographs that had invaded her life, images of her at her most vulnerable, taken without her knowledge. The doorbell rang, jarring her from her thoughts. It was Diego, his face illuminated by the corridor light. "Hey, I brought the tools you needed," he said with a bright smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Paula felt a flutter of unease. His eagerness to help felt a little too intense, as if he were more invested in her security than she was. "Thanks, Diego. I appreciate it," she replied, attempting to mask her discomfort. She stepped aside to let him in, the familiar scent of his cologne mixing with the musty air of her apartment. As Diego set to work, he chatted about everything and nothing, his voice a steady hum in the background. "You know, I really don't think you need these cameras," he said, tightening a screw on the mount. "It's probably just some prankster messing with you. You've got to remember, you're a horror fan. People love to mess with horror fans." Paula frowned, crossing her arms. "But it feels too personal, Diego. It's not just some random joke. These messages, they're invasive." She hesitated, unsure if she should voice her suspicions about him. "What if it's someone I know?" Diego paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's a dangerous way to think, Paula. You can't let your imagination run wild. It's just fear playing tricks on you." He resumed working, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his words were laced with something sinister. As he finished installing the camera, a sudden noise echoed from outside her apartment, a soft thud, followed by a rustling sound that made Paula's heart race. She exchanged a worried glance with Diego, who immediately dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Probably just a cat or something. You know how noisy the neighbors can be." "Yeah, right," she muttered, feeling the anxious knot in her stomach tighten. She glanced toward her door, half expecting it to burst open. After a few moments of silence, Diego stood back, admiring his handiwork. "There, you're all set. Just make sure to check the footage regularly. You never know what you might catch." His smile felt too wide, too forced. "Thanks," Paula said, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. "You'll be around, right? Just in case?" "Always," he replied, his tone overly cheerful, but the intensity in his gaze made her skin crawl. As the evening wore on, Paula tried to distract herself with horror films, but her mind was too restless. The unsettling messages, Diego's odd behavior, and the lingering noise outside gnawed at her. She found herself glancing nervously at the security camera, wishing it could somehow ease her fears. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, she heard it again, a soft rustling outside her door, accompanied by a faint whisper. Her heart raced as she crept toward the door, straining to hear. "Diego?" she called out, but the only response was the silence that enveloped her. Suddenly, a chill swept through the apartment, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The realization struck her like a cold wave. She wasn't just afraid of the messages anymore. She was being surveilled right in her own home. Panic surged within her, and she stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of her rug. "Paula?" Diego's voice pierced through her thoughts, filled with a false concern. "You okay in there? You seem a bit off." "I'm fine," she snapped, her voice sharper than intended. "Just tired." "Let me know if you need anything," he called back, but the way he lingered by the door made her heart pound even faster. She pressed her back against the wall, feeling the coolness seep through her shirt. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and she realized she had to confront her fears head on. But as she lay in bed that night, the shadows danced on the walls, and the unsettling sounds continued, leaving her feeling trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Paula sat on her worn-out couch, the glow of the television flickering over her horror memorabilia scattered throughout the room. The atmosphere, once a comforting embrace, now felt heavy with dread. The security camera she had installed, meant to restore her sense of safety, only amplified her anxiety. She glanced at the monitor, her heart racing as she replayed the footage from the previous night. There it was, a shadowy figure lingering just outside her door, barely visible, but unmistakably there. The sight sent chills down her spine, each replay intensifying her panic. "Why is this happening to me?" she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling. Just then, her phone buzzed violently on the coffee table, snapping her back to the present. It was a message from Diego, her supposed protector. "Hey, I was thinking about you. Everything okay?" The innocent tone made her stomach churn. She felt an overwhelming urge to confide in him, to seek his reassurance, but doubt gnawed at her. How could she explain her fears when she was beginning to suspect him? She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Diego, can you come over? I need to talk," she typed, her fingers hovering over the screen before hitting send. While waiting for his response, she paced the room, her mind racing with possibilities. What if Diego was involved? The way he had been questioning her about her routines, the odd glimmer in his eyes when she spoke about her fears, it all felt wrong. When Diego finally arrived, his presence filled the small apartment with an unsettling energy. He wore a casual smile, but it felt forced, like a mask hiding something darker. "Hey, pal, what's going on?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with an air of finality that made her shiver. I need to talk about the cameras," she began, her voice wavering. "I saw someone outside last night. I'm scared, Diego." "Scared? Of what?" he replied, a hint of incredulity in his voice. "It's probably just some neighborhood kid messing around. You know how it is." Paula's heart sank. But it didn't look like a kid. This person was watching me, Diego. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being followed. Diego leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You're overreacting. You've always had a vivid imagination with your horror movies. It's probably just a prank. You can't let fear control you like this." "Control me? You don't understand," she snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You don't know what it's like to feel unsafe in your own home." He straightened up, his expression shifting from amusement to something more serious. Okay. Let's just take a step back. Maybe you need to take a break from all this horror stuff. It's messing with your head." Paula's eyes narrowed. "You think it's the movies? You think I'm imagining this?" "Look," Diego sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm just trying to help. You know I care about you, right? I wouldn't let anything happen to you." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Paula felt her heart race, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. "I appreciate that, Diego. But I really think I need to talk to someone else, someone who can help." "Like who?" he pressed, his voice a little too sharp. "You think Carlos can help? The guy from upstairs?" "Carlos is nice," Paula replied defensively. "He's been keeping an eye on me. I feel safer when he's around." "Safer?" Diego's tone was incredulous, his brow furrowing. "You don't even know him that well. He could be the one doing this." "Stop it!" Paula shouted, her voice echoing in the small space. "I'm done with this. I need to trust someone right now, and it's not you." Diego's face fell, the mask of concern slipping away to reveal a flicker of anger beneath. "Fine, do what you want. Just remember, I was the one looking out for you. I'm always here if you need me." With that, he turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. The sound reverberated through the apartment, leaving Paula breathless. She sank onto the couch, her heart pounding. The isolation clawed at her, and the shadows around her felt more oppressive than ever. Just then, a gentle knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. It was Carlos, who had become an unexpected source of comfort. "Hey, Paula, it's me. Can I come in?" "Yeah, please," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. As he stepped inside, she could see the concern etched on his face. "I heard you and Diego arguing. Is everything okay?" Paula shook her head, fighting back tears. "I don't know who to trust anymore, Carlos. I just feel so unsafe." "Let me help," he said softly, stepping closer. "I'll keep an eye on the building for you. You're not alone in this." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, but deep down a voice whispered that she was still trapped in a nightmare, one that was far from over. The tension in Paula's apartment reached a fever pitch when she discovered the note slipped under her door. Her heart raced as she unfolded the piece of paper, her hands trembling. The handwriting was unmistakably Diego's familiar scrawl, but the words twisted her stomach into knots. "I'm protecting you, Paula. You need to understand that whoever is watching you is dangerous. I have to keep you safe." A wave of nausea washed over her. How could he think this was protection? She felt exposed, a target under the microscope of his delusions. She glanced around her apartment, her sanctuary now feeling like a cage. The horror memorabilia that once brought her joy now seemed to mock her. She scrambled to barricade her door, pushing against it with her weight, the sound of her breathing echoing in the silence. "Paola!" Diego's voice sliced through the tension like a knife. "Open the door. Please, I need to talk to you." His tone was frantic, laced with a desperation that made her skin crawl. "No, just go away," she shouted, her voice trembling, betraying her fear. "I can't let you be in danger. You don't understand." His voice cracked, and she could hear him pacing outside, his footsteps sharp against the wooden floor of the hallway. "You have to trust me." Trust? The very idea sent a chill down her spine. She felt like a character in one of her horror films, trapped in a scene that spiraled out of control. She pressed her back against the door, wishing she could disappear. The muffled sounds of Diego's pleas turned into a droning buzz, her heart pounding in her ears. Just then, she heard a different voice, one that was unexpected yet oddly reassuring. "Diego, back off! You're scaring her!" It was Carlos. She felt a surge of relief wash over her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the dread of what might happen next. "Stay out of this, Carlos," Diego snapped, his voice laced with anger. "You don't know what's going on. I'm trying to protect her." "Protecting her? You're the one who's making her feel unsafe," Carlos shot back, his voice steady and firm. "You need to leave her alone." Paula's heart raced as she realized Carlos was standing up for her. She could hear the tension crackle in the air like the moments before a storm. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to catch every word. "Let's just talk this through, Diego," Carlos continued, his tone softening, trying to reach the man he knew. "She doesn't need this. You have to stop this madness." The silence that followed felt heavy, like the calm before an explosion. Paula's breath hitched as she imagined the confrontation brewing outside. She could hear Diego's labored breathing, a mixture of anger and desperation. "You don't understand. She's mine to protect." "Not like this," Carlos's voice had taken on a sharper edge. "You're crossing a line, man. This isn't love, it's obsession." In that moment, the door rattled violently, an explosion of noise and chaos. "Paula!" Diego's voice morphed from pleading to something darker. "I can't let you stay in danger. I won't let you." The door gave way, crashing open as Diego forced it open with a primal roar. Paula stumbled back, her heart racing faster than she thought possible. There he stood, eyes wild, hair disheveled, a man transformed by his own madness. "Diego, please," she gasped, fear clawing at her throat. His expression shifted, a mix of rage and something that resembled desperation. "You don't get it, do you? I'm the only one who can save you." Before Paula could respond, Carlos stepped into the fray, positioning himself between her and Diego. "Get away from her!" Carlos shouted, his body tense with determination. "Stay out of it!" Diego roared back, lunging forward. In that instant, chaos erupted. Carlos and Diego grappled, the struggle fierce, each man fighting for what they believed was right. Paula stood frozen, horror etched on her face as she watched the violence unfold, feeling completely powerless. "Stop! Please, stop!" she cried, but her voice was lost in the chaos. In a split second, Carlos lost his footing, and in a desperate attempt to regain control, he pushed Diego back. The shove sent Diego stumbling, his eyes wide in shock as he barreled toward the open doorway. Time seemed to slow as he fell, the expression on his face a haunting mix of betrayal and madness. Paula's breath caught in her throat, the world around her fading into a blur. She could only watch as the man who had once been her friend tumbled into the abyss, leaving her trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The tension in the air was palpable as Paula stood frozen, heart pounding wildly in her chest, her mind racing with disbelief. The chaos of the moment swirled around her, a cacophony of emotions that threatened to drown her. Diego, his face twisted in anger and desperation, had just been confronted by Carlos, the neighbor whose presence had once brought her a semblance of safety. But now, the situation had spiraled into a nightmare. "Carlos, what are you doing?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper, caught between fear and confusion. She clutched the doorframe, a feeble barrier against the storm brewing within her apartment. "It's okay, Paula. I'm here to protect you," Carlos replied, his tone calm yet insistent, as if he were trying to soothe a frightened child. But the words felt heavy, laced with an unsettling undertone that made Paula's skin crawl. "Protect me? From what? From him?" she shot back, her eyes darting between the two men, each representing a different kind of danger. Diego's manic energy contrasted sharply with Carlos's unsettling calm, and she felt herself teetering on the edge of panic. "Paula, you don't understand," Diego interjected, his voice rising with desperation. "He's not your friend. He's been watching you just as I have. You think I've been the problem? I was trying to keep you safe from him." "Safe?" she echoed incredulously. "You think stalking me is keeping me safe? You sent those messages, didn't you? You're the one who made me feel like I was in danger. I did it to protect you from what he could do." Diego's eyes flickered with a mix of sorrow and mania. "You don't know him. You can't trust him." "Enough!" Carlos's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "This isn't about trust anymore, Diego. You've lost sight of reality. You're the one who's dangerous." In that moment of chaos, as emotions boiled over, Diego lunged at Carlos, and Paula's world narrowed down to the grappling of the two men. She watched in horror as they collided, the sound of their bodies crashing against furniture echoing through the small apartment. Diego's anger was raw and unrestrained, while Carlos's strength seemed calculated, fueled by a sense of twisted righteousness. "Get away from her!" Diego yelled, shoving Carlos against the wall. "You think you're her hero? You're just another threat. Let go of me," Carlos grunted, struggling to regain control. "You're blinded by your obsession, Diego." Paula's heart raced as she backed away, feeling trapped in her own home. The shadows of betrayal loomed larger than ever, engulfing her in a suffocating darkness. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor, paralyzed by the revelation that her sanctuary had become a battleground. In a sudden surge of desperation, Carlos managed to push Diego back, but the momentum sent Diego staggering toward the open doorway. Time seemed to slow as Paula watched, horror-stricken, as he lost his footing and tumbled backward, his scream echoing in the hallway, before a sickening thud silenced him. "Diego!" she cried, rushing to the door, her heart plummeting into her stomach as she peered out into the dimly lit corridor. The sight was grotesque. Diego lay motionless at the base of the stairs, his body crumpled in a way that defied the laws of nature. The reality of what had just unfolded hit Paula like a tidal wave. "What have you done?" she whispered, turning to Carlos, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and betrayal. "It was an accident," Carlos said, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "He was out of control. I didn't mean for this to happen." Paula felt her world shatter around her, the weight of the situation crashing down upon her. She had thought Carlos was her ally, but now she stood alone, the remnants of her trust scattered like shards of glass. The true horror lay not in the actions of either man, but in the realization that both had been driven by their own twisted visions of protection, leaving her in a spiral of betrayal. "Get out," she said, her voice a mere whisper, laced with a newfound strength. "I don't want to see you again." Carlos stared at her, a mix of understanding and fear crossing his features. "Paula, please." "Get out!" she shouted, the remnants of her courage igniting into a flame. As he stepped back, she closed the door firmly, sealing herself inside her apartment once more, now a hollow shell of safety. The nightmare had only just begun, and she was left to confront the terrifying truth. She was utterly alone, trapped in a web of her own making, haunted by the faces of those she had once trusted. In the sleepy suburb of Maplewood, where the sun-drenched lawns swayed gently in the warm breeze, two sisters, Clara and Lucia, found solace in their backyard. The scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air as they played an intense game of tag, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. With their hair flowing behind them like ribbons in the wind, they were an embodiment of childhood innocence, lost in the joys of summer. "Catch me if you can, Lucia," Clara shouted, her cheeks flushed with excitement as she dashed around their swing set. Lucia, a year younger but equally determined, took off after her sister, her ponytail bouncing with each stride. As they played, Clara's gaze inadvertently drifted toward the large, imposing house next door. It was an old structure, its paint peeling, and the garden overrun with weeds. It belonged to Bob, a man whose presence had always felt oddly out of place in the neighborhood. He rarely ventured outside, but when he did, it was usually to stare at the children playing nearby with an intensity that set Clara's nerves on edge. "Do you think he's watching us again?" Lucia asked, slowing down as she noticed Clara's distracted expression. Clara swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I don't know, but it feels like he's always looking." Just then, a flicker of movement caught Clara's eye, and her heart raced as she spotted Bob peering through the window of his dimly lit living room. His expression was unsettlingly focused, his eyes locked onto them like a predator sizing up its prey. She felt a shiver run down her spine, prompting her to grab Lucia's hand. "Let's go inside," Clara urged, pulling her sister toward the back door. Later that day, while their mother prepared dinner, Clara and Lucia overheard a conversation that would deepen their unease. "I told you kids to steer clear of Bob," their mother warned a group of neighborhood kids gathered nearby. "He's not someone you want to mess with. Just stay away from his house." "Why?" one of the children asked, curiosity lighting up his face. "He's different," their mother replied, her tone heavy with concern. "Just promise me you won't go near him, all right?" The warning gnawed at Clara's mind, and she exchanged a worried glance with Lucia. "What do you think she means by different?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know, but it sounds serious," Lucia replied, her eyes darting toward Bob's house once more. The girls' curiosity was piqued, but so was their fear. The following evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Clara and Lucia walked home from school. The street was quiet, the chirping of crickets slowly taking over the muted sounds of day. Suddenly, they spotted Bob standing near his mailbox, a wide, unsettling grin stretching across his face. "Hello, girls," he called out, his voice overly cheerful. "Would you like some candy?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bag, its colorful wrappers glinting in the fading light. Clara felt her heart race. "No, thank you," she shouted, quickening her pace. Lucia matched her speed, both girls feeling an overwhelming urge to escape his presence. "Why are you in such a hurry?" Bob called after them, his tone still oddly cheerful, but there was an edge to it that sent chills down Clara's spine. Once they reached the safety of their home, Clara slammed the door behind them, leaning against it as if it could ward off any lingering shadows. "Did you see how he looked at us?" she gasped, her breath quickening. "That smile, it wasn't normal." Lucia nodded vigorously, her eyes wide. "I don't want to go outside anymore. What if he tries to talk to us again?" Their mother entered the room, catching the tail end of their conversation. "What's wrong, girls?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Clara and Lucia exchanged a glance, the weight of their fear lingering in the air, unspoken but palpable. "Bob is just strange," Clara finally managed to say, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Their mother sighed, a shadow crossing her face. "Just remember what I said. Keep your distance. And if anything feels off, you come to me right away." As the evening settled, the sisters sat on their beds, their minds racing with thoughts of Bob. The neighborhood, once a safe haven, now felt like a web of uncertainty, each corner hiding secrets they were too young to comprehend. Little did they know, the events of that summer would unravel in ways that would forever change their lives. Clara and Lucia huddled together in their dimly lit room, the remnants of daylight filtering through the curtains. The unsettling presence of Bob weighed heavily on their minds, stirring a pot of anxiety that refused to settle. "What if he really is a bad guy?" Clara whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. Lucia bit her lip, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting Bob to appear in their doorway. "Let's just tell the others," Lucia suggested, though her tone was less confident than she had hoped. "Maybe they'll understand." They decided to meet their friends at the playground, a place that usually brought joy but now felt tainted by their fears. As they approached, they spotted Sarah and Max swinging under the fading sun. "Hey, you two, come swing with us," Max called, grinning widely. Clara and Lucia exchanged glances before walking over, the weight of their dread still hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Guys, we need to talk about Bob," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah paused mid-swing, her brows furrowing. "Bob? The guy who lives next door? He's just weird, that's all. He's harmless, I promise." "Yeah, I mean, he gives out candy and stuff," Max chimed in, dismissing their concerns with a wave of his hand. "You're just being dramatic. Everyone knows he's a little off, but who isn't?" "But he watches us, like really watches," Lucia interjected, her voice rising in desperation. "We saw him staring at us from his window. And Mom told us to stay away." Sarah shrugged, her confidence unshaken. "You're just overthinking it. He's probably just lonely. Maybe he just wants friends." Clara felt a surge of frustration. "Friends? He's not a friend. He's creepy." "Whatever, you guys are just scared for no reason," Max said, launching back into his swing, as if to further emphasize their perceived foolishness. The sisters exchanged a look, their fears dismissed once again. As they turned to leave, Clara's heart raced. "What if we're right?" she murmured, her thoughts spiraling. Lucia nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Days passed, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow. One afternoon, Clara checked the mailbox, her heart pounding with every step. As she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, she found an envelope with their names scrawled in a jagged handwriting. Hesitantly, she pulled out a piece of paper, revealing a drawing that made her blood run cold. It depicted both sisters standing in front of their house, but looming behind them were dark, ominous figures, their outlines jagged and grotesque. "Lucia, come look at this!" Clara gasped, her voice laced with panic. Lucia rushed over, her eyes widening as she examined the drawing. "Who would do this?" she asked, her voice trembling. It's wrong." "Do you think it's Bob?" Clara whispered, fear clawing at her throat. They exchanged terrified glances, their imaginations racing with the implications of the drawing. That night, as the moon cast eerie shadows across the playground, Lucia decided to take a late-night walk to clear her head. "Let's just go check," she suggested, her bravery shining through the fear. Clara hesitated but followed her sister, hoping it would ease their anxiety. As they approached the playground, Lucia's heart raced. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her ears picking up a faint whispering. They crept closer, their breaths shallow. In the dim light, they spotted Bob standing near the swings, his back turned to them, muttering to himself. "Clara, we need to go, now!" Lucia pulled Clara's arm, urgency lacing her voice. They turned to flee, but the sight of Bob's hunched figure and the low, sinister whispers sent chills down their spines. They hurried back home, their minds racing with fear. Once inside, they locked the door and leaned against it, their hearts pounding like war drums. "What if he's really dangerous?" Clara whispered again, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't tell Mom. She won't believe us." Lucia nodded, her mind still reeling from the encounter. "We have to figure this out ourselves. We can't let him get to us." But the truth was, they felt utterly powerless, trapped in a web of fear, as the shadows of their neighbor loomed ever closer. The night air was thick with an uneasy tension as Clara and Lucia settled into their sleeping bags in Lucia's room. The sisters had made a pact to confront their fears, believing that a sleepover might shield them from the lurking shadows of their neighborhood. Lucia flicked off the bedside lamp, and the room was plunged into a comforting darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of stars peeking through the window. "Do you think we'll be safe here?" Clara whispered, her voice barely rising above the rustle of their sleeping bags. Lucia rolled over, her brow furrowed. "I don't know, Clara, but we're together, and that's what matters." She tried to sound confident, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. As the clock ticked past midnight, the sisters drifted into a fitful sleep, the day's worries blending into their dreams. Suddenly, a strange noise broke through the stillness, a soft rustling, followed by a low, eerie chuckle that sent chills down their spines. Clara bolted upright, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she gasped, shaking Lucia awake. "What?" Lucia murmured, still half asleep. But as the sounds continued, her eyes widened in terror, and she instinctively grabbed Clara's arm. They both crept toward the window, their breaths held tight in their chests. Peering through the curtains, the girls could hardly believe what they saw. Bob stood in their yard, bathed in moonlight, his face illuminated in an unsettling grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally across his features. He was staring directly at them, his eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. "Clara, we need to lock the door," Lucia urged, her voice trembling. They stumbled back from the window, their hearts pounding in unison as they rushed to secure the door. Clara slid the lock into place while Lucia pressed her back against it, both of them breathing heavily, trying to suppress the panic rising within them. "Why is he here?" Clara whispered, her voice quavering. What does he want? I don't know, Lucia replied, her eyes wide with fear. But we can't stay here. We have to tell Mom. Gathering their courage, they crept down the hallway, the wooden floors creaking beneath their feet. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and they exchanged anxious glances as they reached their mother's bedroom. Lucia knocked softly, her heart racing as they waited for a response. Mom, Clara called out, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk. It's important. They heard movement from inside before the door creaked open, revealing their mother, her brow furrowed with concern. What's wrong, girls? Bob. He's in our yard, Lucia stammered, her words tumbling out in a rush. He was staring at us. We locked the door, but he's out there. Their mother's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and worry crossing her features. Bob, are you sure? She asked, glancing toward the window as if expecting to see him there. Yes, we saw him, Clara insisted, her voice rising slightly in desperation. He was just standing there, smiling at us. Their mother's eyes darkened as she took a deep breath. I've been meaning to talk to you about him, she said slowly. Bob has been acting strangely toward me too. I thought it was just my imagination, but maybe it's not. Clara and Lucia exchanged worried glances. What do you mean? Lucia asked, her curiosity piqued despite the fear that gripped her. There have been some odd things happening lately. I thought I was just being paranoid. But I've seen him watching me too. Even when I'm outside, their mother admitted, her voice low and serious. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled in. The sisters felt a cold shiver run down their spines, their earlier resolve crumbling under the weight of shared fear. We have to do something, Clara said firmly, her determination igniting. We can't just let him keep watching us. Let's call the police, Lucia suggested, her voice steadying as adrenaline surged through her veins. They need to know what's happening. Their mother nodded, her expression resolute. All right, let's do that. But first, let's make sure the doors and windows are locked tight. As they moved to secure their home, the girls could still feel the unsettling presence of Bob lurking just outside, his figure etched into their memories, a shadow that would not easily fade. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a chilling chapter that would intertwine their lives with secrets far darker than they could imagine. Clara and Lucia had barely begun to catch their breath after the terrifying encounter with Bob outside their window, when they stumbled upon something that would forever change their understanding of the man who haunted their lives. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon, and the sun filtered through the curtains of their mother's bedroom, casting playful shadows on the carpet. Clara, feeling restless, decided to rummage through the drawers of a vintage vanity that adorned the room. Lucia, sitting cross-legged on the bed, watched her sister with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. What are you looking for? Lucia asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the mere act of speaking about Bob could summon him once more. I don't know. Maybe something that helps me understand why he's so creepy, Clara replied, her brows furrowed in concentration. She pulled out a stack of old letters and photographs, each one revealing snippets of a lifelong past. Lucia leaned over, intrigued. Look at this, Clara exclaimed, holding up a faded photograph of a group of children playing in a park, their faces lit with joy. But in the background, barely noticeable, stood a figure that sent chills down their spines. It was Bob, his silhouette unmistakable, even in the grainy image. Why is he in this? Lucia asked, her heart racing. I don't know, but we need to find out. Clara's voice was firm, her determination ignited. They continued digging through the vanity until they stumbled upon a small, leather-bound journal. The spine was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. Clara opened it cautiously, a sense of dread washing over her as she began to read. Dear Diary, Clara read aloud, her voice trembling. Today I saw him again. Bob is not like the other kids. He likes to play games, but the games are different. I don't think he's safe. Clara's voice trailed off as she flipped through the pages, revealing more unsettling entries. Their mother had written about her own experiences with Bob, detailing strange occurrences from her childhood, and a growing fear that had never left her. Lucia, our mom knew him too. She was scared of him just like us. Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. "Why didn't she ever tell us?" Lucia replied, a mix of confusion and concern etched on her face. "I don't know, but we have to warn her," Clara said, urgency flooding her voice. The sisters rushed downstairs, clutching the journal tightly. Their mother was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, the aroma of spices filling the air. "Mom!" Clara burst out, startling her mother. "You need to see this." "What is it, dear?" their mother asked, her brow furrowing as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "It's about Bob. You knew him when you were a kid, didn't you? You were scared of him," Lucia chimed in, her words tumbling out in a rush. Their mother's expression shifted, a shadow crossing her face. I thought I'd left that behind. Why are you asking about him?" Clara and Lucia exchanged a look, the weight of the journal heavy in their small hands. "Because he's been acting weird around us. We saw him outside at night and he's been watching us," Clara exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch as panic set in. Their mother's face paled. "What do you mean? Watching you how?" "Like, just standing there smiling," Lucia added, her voice shaking. "And we found this journal, Mom. You wrote about him." Their mother took a deep breath, her eyes darting to the journal. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," she said, her tone sharp. But the fear was evident in her voice. "Mom, this is serious," Clara insisted. "We're scared. We need to know what you went through." As their mother sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the sisters could see the turmoil in her eyes. "Bob has always been different. He used to lure kids with promises of games and fun, but I always felt something was off. I never trusted him, and I thought I was just being silly." "Mom, he's still doing it," Lucia exclaimed. "We saw him trying to get other kids to come over to his house." "I saw him too," Clara added, her heart pounding. "He was standing by the park, calling them over, saying he had a new game to play." Their mother's face hardened. "You girls need to stay away from him. I will talk to the neighbors. This isn't just about you anymore, it's about everyone." The sisters nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. They had shared their secret, and now their mother would join their fight against the lurking danger. But as they exchanged worried glances, a chilling thought crept into their minds. What if Bob had already chosen his next target? Days passed, and the dread of Bob's presence loomed larger than ever. The sisters could feel the weight of his gaze, even at school. One afternoon, as they walked home, Clara spotted him standing across the street, watching them with a twisted grin plastered on his face. "Lucia, look!" Clara hissed, grabbing her sister's arm. Bob stood there, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity, and as he noticed the girl staring, he raised a hand in a slow wave. "What is he doing?" Lucia whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know, but we need to get home. Now!" Clara urged, her heart racing as they quickened their pace, the shadows of their fears stretching behind them. As they neared their house, they exchanged anxious glances. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something darker, something that connected them to Bob in ways they had yet to comprehend. The tension in the suburban neighborhood had reached a boiling point. Clara and Lucia could feel it in the air, a palpable unease that seemed to seep into the very fabric of their lives. Parents exchanged hushed whispers at the school gates, and children approached their homes with wary glances over their shoulders. It was no longer just the sisters who were concerned about Bob. The entire community was on high alert. One crisp, clear evening, a neighborhood meeting was called at the local community center. Clara and Lucia sat in the back, their hearts racing as they listened to the murmurs of discontent that filled the room. The bright fluorescent lights flickered above them, casting long shadows on the walls, amplifying the sense of dread that hung like a thick fog. "Something needs to be done about that man," Mr. Thompson, a burly man with a booming voice, shouted from the front. "I've seen him lurking around the park, watching our kids. This isn't just about us, it's about their safety." "I heard he tried to give candy to some kids on their way home," Mrs. Henderson, a concerned mother, chimed in. "We can't just stand by and let this continue." The girls exchanged nervous glances, remembering the encounters they'd had with Bob, the candy, the staring, the way he seemed to seep into their nightmares. Clara's voice trembled as she leaned closer to Lucia. "What if he knows we're afraid? What if he comes after us? We can't let him intimidate us, Lucia whispered back, her eyes glinting with determination. We have to do something. We'll confront him ourselves. As the meeting wore on, the sisters concocted a plan. They would approach Bob's house that very night, armed with nothing but flashlights and their courage. The idea thrilled and terrified them in equal measure. With each step, they felt the gravity of their decision weighing heavily on their young shoulders. Later that evening, as the moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood, Clara and Lucia crept through the quiet streets towards Bob's house. Shadows danced along the pavement, and the night air was thick with anticipation. They reached his front yard, the lawn overgrown and unkempt, just as they had always seen it. "Are you ready?" Clara whispered, her heart racing like a drum in her chest. "Ready as I'll ever be," Lucia replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. They approached the front door, which stood ajar, creaking ominously as they pushed it open. The interior was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight that spilled in through the window, illuminating a dusty living room filled with mismatched furniture and a thick layer of silence. "Bob?" Clara called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. No response. "Maybe he's not home." "Let's check the basement," Lucia suggested. Her curiosity piqued. The basement door stood slightly ajar, a dark void beckoning them forward. They exchanged a glance, and with a deep breath, they descended the creaking stairs. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, a stark contrast that sent shivers down their spines. As they reached the bottom, the air grew thick and heavy, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint sound of something scraping against the floor. Heart pounding, Clara shone her flashlight around the dimly lit space. "Did you hear that?" Lucia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," Clara replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It's coming from over there." She pointed toward a corner of the room where shadows seemed to writhe and twist. As they approached, the scraping sound grew louder, a chilling reminder that they were not alone. Suddenly, the flashlight beam fell upon a door that had been hidden behind a stack of old boxes. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. "Do you think we should go in?" Lucia asked, her voice trembling. Clara hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. "We have to know what he's hiding. We can't let him keep scaring us." With a shared nod, they pushed the door open. The sight before them was staggering, a hidden room filled with disturbing memorabilia. Walls lined with photographs of children, their faces eerily familiar, and shelves cluttered with toys, all suspended in an unsettling stillness. Clara's heart dropped as she recognized the familiar faces of their friends among the collection. "Lucia, we need to get out of here," Clara stammered, stepping back as her mind raced with horror. "This is wrong." But before they could retreat, a loud crash echoed through the basement, sending the sisters into a panic. They turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the darkness. Desperation clawed at their throats as they banged on the door, their voices rising in frantic cries for help. The basement was suffocating, the air thick with dust, and an unshakable sense of dread. Clara and Lucia exchanged anxious glances, their hearts pounding in their chests as they tried to make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. The loud crash that reverberated through the dimly lit space had sent them stumbling backward, their minds racing with thoughts of escape. "What was that?" Lucia whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their own heavy breathing. "I don't know," Clara replied, her eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to stretch and contort around them. "But we need to get out of here." They rushed toward the stairs, but as they reached the top, they discovered the door had slammed shut, sealing their only exit. Panic coursed through Clara's veins as she rattled the doorknob frantically, but it wouldn't budge. "Lucia, it's locked. We're trapped." "Calm down," Lucia urged, trying to sound more composed than she felt. "Let's look around. There has to be another way out." Their surroundings were unsettling, filled with remnants of Bob's twisted obsessions. Old toys, faded photographs, and strange trinkets cluttered the shelves. Clara's gaze fell upon a dusty box in the corner. She approached it hesitantly, brushing away the cobwebs that clung to it. When she opened it, a collection of journals spilled out, their pages yellowed with age. They're his journals, Clara said, her voice trembling as she thumbed through the pages. He wrote about us. What do you mean? Lucia asked, peering over Clara's shoulder. He's been watching us for a long time. He knew our names, where we went to school, everything. Clara's voice broke as she read a passage aloud. The sisters are special. They are the key to what lies beneath. What does that even mean? Before Lucia could respond, another loud crash echoed through the basement, making them jump. We have to find a way out, Lucia insisted, her eyes wide with fear. As they searched frantically, Clara's fingers grazed over a cold metallic surface, hidden behind a stack of boxes. She pulled it away to reveal a trapdoor. Look, this might lead somewhere. Open it, Lucia urged, her heart racing. With trembling hands, Clara lifted the door, revealing a narrow, dark passageway that seemed to descend into the abyss. They hesitated, exchanging terrified glances. This is insane, but we can't stay here, Lucia said, her determination hardening. We have to go. Clara nodded, and together they climbed down into the dark tunnel, the air growing cooler as they descended. The faint sound of dripping water echoed around them, creating an eerie soundtrack to their desperate escape. They stumbled forward, their senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat. Suddenly, they emerged into a larger underground chamber. The walls were lined with stone and strange markings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the center of the room lay a massive, ancient chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. What is this place? Lucia breathed, stepping closer to the chest. I don't know, but I have a bad feeling about it, Clara replied, her instinct screaming at her to turn back. Ignoring the warning in her mind, Lucia reached for the chest's latch. We need to find out what's going on, Clara. This could be important. With a reluctant sigh, Clara nodded, and together they opened the chest. Inside, they found a collection of unsettling items, old photographs, documents with their family's name, and a locket that looked strikingly familiar. Clara recognized it instantly. It had belonged to their mother. Why would he have this? Clara asked, her voice trembling as she held the locket in her hand. Before Lucia could respond, they heard footsteps approaching. The girls exchanged horrified glances. We have to hide, Clara hissed, and they scrambled to find a place to conceal themselves. As they crouched behind the chest, the door to the chamber creaked open, revealing Bob's silhouette. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. You're not supposed to be here, he said, his voice low and menacing. The sisters held their breath, hearts racing as they listened to him mutter to himself, words that felt like a warning. It's time to protect the secret. They can never know. In that moment, the gravity of their situation settled over them like a heavy shroud. They weren't just dealing with a strange neighbor. They were entangled in a sinister web that connected their family to Bob's dark past. Just as Bob turned to leave, the girls seized their chance. They dashed toward the exit, fear propelling them forward, and somehow managed to push through the door just as it slammed shut behind them. They emerged back into the light of the basement, but the world outside was in chaos. Neighbors were milling about, their faces twisted in confusion and fear. "Where's Bob?" a voice shouted, panic rippling through the crowd. "Bob, he's gone," Clara cried, her heart racing. "He was just in the basement." But as the sisters tried to explain, their words fell on deaf ears. No one believed them. They were met with skepticism and suspicion. As Clara and Lucia stood amidst the chaos, the chilling realization sank in. They had uncovered a truth that would forever alter their lives, and now, in a neighborhood that once felt safe, they felt more alone than ever. The darkness they sought to escape was now intertwined with their very existence, and they had no idea how to break free. Marco stepped out of the taxi, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The city buzzed around him, a vibrant tapestry of life that pulsed with energy. He took a moment to absorb his new surroundings. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden hue over the buildings that loomed like sentinels around him. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag over his shoulder and approached the imposing structure of his new apartment complex. its sleek lines and modern facade promising a fresh start. As he entered the lobby, he was greeted by the soft hum of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting from a small cafe tucked into one corner. The decor was chic, with minimalist furniture and potted plants that added a touch of warmth to the otherwise sterile environment. Marcos couldn't help but smile. This place felt like home already. "Excuse me?" a voice called out, pulling him from his reverie. He turned to find a friendly-looking woman in her 30s with curly hair and an infectious smile. "You must be the new tenant. I'm Luciana, your neighbor." "Marcos," he replied, extending a hand. "Nice to meet you." "Welcome. If you need anything, just knock on my door. I'm right across the hall," she said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Thank you. I might take you up on that." Marcos felt a wave of relief wash over him. Luciana seemed warm and inviting, a reassuring presence in this unfamiliar city. After a brief chat, Marcos made his way to the elevator, riding it up to the 6th floor. As he stepped into his new apartment, he was greeted by an open layout with large windows that offered stunning views of the city skyline. The walls were painted a soft beige, and sunlight poured in, illuminating the space and filling it with warmth. He dropped his bag on the floor and wandered through each room, marveling at the polished hardwood floors and the modern kitchen that had everything he could ever need. Once he settled in, the sun dipped below the horizon, and a cool breeze began to flow through the open window. Marcos busied himself unpacking, the familiar rhythm of placing books on shelves and arranging his belongings grounding him in this new chapter of his life. As night fell, the city came alive with shimmering lights, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of his apartment. But as he began to unwind, he noticed a faint scratching noise emanating from somewhere within the walls. It was a delicate sound, almost like a tiny creature scurrying about. He paused, his hands frozen mid-air, but quickly dismissed it. "Just the building settling," he muttered to himself, shaking off the unease that crept into his thoughts. Later, as he tucked himself into bed, the noise returned, sharper now, like nails dragging against wood. He pulled the blanket tighter around him and tried to focus on the city sounds outside. Cars honking, laughter echoing from nearby bars. But the scratching persisted, gnawing away at his peace. Hours passed, and sleep eluded him. It was during one of his restless turns that he caught a glimpse of movement outside his window. Heart racing, he sat up and peered through the glass, squinting into the darkness. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the reach of the streetlights, cloaked in the night. The figure seemed to be watching, unmoving, sending a shiver down Marcos's spine. "Is someone there?" he whispered, half expecting a response. But the figure melted into the darkness, leaving him alone with his wild imagination. He shook his head, trying to rationalize what he had seen. It was probably just a trick of the light, or perhaps his mind playing games with him after a long day. Yet as he lay back down, the scratching noise resumed, this time louder and more insistent. Marcos squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to believe that everything was normal, that he was safe in his new home. But deep down, a sense of foreboding began to burrow into his thoughts, planting seeds of dread that would soon grow into something he could no longer ignore. Marcos sat on the edge of his sleek, modern couch, the vibrant city lights casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the walls of his new apartment. The allure of the bustling streets below had initially filled him with excitement, but with the recent unsettling events, that enthusiasm was slowly being replaced by a creeping dread. The memory of the shadowy figure outside his window was etched in his mind, haunting him like a specter in the night. Determined to reclaim his sense of safety, he resolved to install security cameras around his apartment. He spent the next morning meticulously setting up the cameras, ensuring each angle captured every nook and cranny of his home. As he tightened the last screw on the final camera, he took a step back and surveyed his work. "This should do it," he murmured to himself, a hint of relief washing over him. He could almost convince himself that he was in control of the situation again. As dusk fell, Marcos sat at his desk, anxiety gnawing at him. He decided to review the footage from earlier in the day, hoping to find nothing more than the usual comings and goings of the city. He clicked play, the screen flickering to life, At first, all he saw were passers-by, the hustle of the city echoing in the background. But then, a chill ran down his spine as he noticed something. A figure loitering just outside his window, camouflaged in the shadows cast by the streetlights. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered, his heart racing. The figure appeared to be watching, standing still for what felt like an eternity. Marcos leaned closer to the screen, squinting as if it could help him recognize the man. But the darkness obscured any sense of familiarity, leaving only the oppressive weight of fear. Marcos jolted upright, his mind racing. He needed to talk to someone, to voice his fears. He remembered Luciana, his neighbor from down the hall, who had been friendly during his move-in. Perhaps she could offer some perspective. He knocked on her door, his heart pounding. Luciana answered almost immediately, her warm smile fading slightly upon seeing his distressed expression. "Hey, Marcos, everything okay?" "No, not really," he admitted, stepping into her cozy apartment, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wrapping around him like a warm blanket. "I've been hearing some strange noises and I think someone's been watching me." Luciana raised an eyebrow, concern flashing across her face. "What do you mean, watching you?" He took a deep breath, trying to articulate the dread that had settled in his chest. "I set up cameras and I saw a figure outside my window. It felt like he was just standing there." She leaned back, crossing her arms as she considered his words. "Marcos, it's a busy city. People walk by all the time. Maybe it was just a passerby. You might be overreacting." "But it felt wrong," he insisted, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I've never felt this way before." Luciana softened, her expression shifting to one of empathy. "I get it. Moving can be overwhelming, and it's easy to let your imagination take over. Why don't you focus on getting settled? Maybe invite some friends over. It'll help take your mind off things." Marcos nodded, though he could feel the doubt lingering in his mind. "Yeah, I guess so. I just don't want to feel like this anymore." "Why don't we grab a coffee later?" she suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "It'll be fun. Just a casual outing, nothing serious." "Sure, that sounds nice." His voice was quieter now, the idea of normalcy slightly soothing his frayed nerves. They chatted for a few more minutes before he left her apartment, but as he stepped back into the hallway, the sense of unease settled back around him like a thick fog. The night dragged on, and as he lay in bed, the sounds of the city drifted through his open window. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, he could almost feel the presence of the figure lurking just beyond his line of sight. Sleep eluded him, and the shadows danced on the walls, whispering secrets he could not understand. He had sought a fresh start, but instead he found himself ensnared in a web of fear, uncertainty, and an unsettling feeling that his life was spiraling into something he couldn't control. Marcos felt as though the walls of his apartment were closing in on him. The once inviting space, filled with modern furnishings and a breathtaking view of the city skyline, had transformed into a prison of shadows and whispers. The scratching noises had escalated from mere nuisances to a cacophony that echoed through the silence of the night, gnawing at his sanity. Each sound was a reminder that he was not alone, that something, someone, was lurking just beyond his sight. Sleepless nights had become the norm. Marcos tossed and turned, the sheets tangled around his legs as he stared at the ceiling, willing himself to find peace in the darkness. The city outside his window buzzed with life, yet inside he felt isolated, trapped in an echo chamber of his own fears. He had tried everything, white noise machines, meditation apps, even herbal teas, but nothing could drown out the sound of his own racing heart. One particularly restless night, with the clock inching toward 3 a.m., Marcos sat up in bed, his heart thrumming wildly. He could have sworn he heard footsteps in the hallway. He slid out of bed, the cool floor sending a jolt through him. With cautious steps, he approached the window, peering through the blinds. The street below was empty, the only movement coming from the flickering streetlights. "Get a grip, Marcos," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "You're just being paranoid." But deep down, he felt the weight of an unseen gaze, a feeling of being scrutinized that he couldn't shake. The following evening, he decided to confront his fears head-on. Clenching his jaw, he donned a jacket and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. He would not be a prisoner in his own home. He strode down the dimly lit hallway, his breath coming in quick bursts as he approached the exit. Just as he pushed the door open, a movement caught his eye, a figure darting away into the shadows. His heart skipped a beat. "Hey, you!" Marcos shouted, adrenaline surging through him. He bolted after the figure, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. "Stop, I'm not afraid of you." But just as quickly as he had spotted the figure, it vanished into the darkness, leaving him breathless and confused in the empty corridor. Panting heavily, he leaned against the wall, trying to steady himself. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, half expecting an answer from the shadows. He turned back towards his apartment, the sense of dread settling deeper in his stomach. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through his window, he hoped the night's events had been a figment of his imagination. However, as he opened his front door to retrieve the morning newspaper, he was met with an envelope slipped under his doormat. His heart sank. He picked it up, fingers trembling as he opened it. The note was hastily written, the ink smudged in places. "Leave the apartment immediately," it warned. "You are not safe here." Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. Who had written this? The handwriting was jagged and uneven, a reflection of the turmoil inside him. He glanced around the hallway, but it was as quiet as a graveyard, the only sound being the distant hum of traffic below. He stepped back into his apartment, slamming the door behind him, his mind racing. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered to himself, pacing the room. He grabbed his phone and dialed Luciana's number, hoping to find some solace in her familiar voice. "Luciana, it's me," he said as soon as she picked up, his voice edged with panic. I found a note. Someone's telling me to leave. I don't know what to think." "Marcos, breathe," she urged, her tone soothing yet firm. "You're safe in your apartment. It's just a prank, I'm sure. People do weird things. Have you thought about installing more locks or maybe a security system?" "I already did that," he snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not about the locks, Luciana. I feel like I'm being watched, like someone is always there, just lurking in the shadows." "Maybe it's just the stress of moving," she suggested gently. "Take a deep breath. You'll get through this. It's a new place, and it can be overwhelming. Just don't let your imagination run wild." As they spoke, Marcos could feel the weight of her words pushing against his anxiety. But a sliver of doubt crept in. Was he truly overreacting, or was there something more sinister at play? He hung up the phone, staring out the window at the city below. The vibrant life continued, oblivious to the turmoil brewing within him. In that moment, he realized that what haunted him the most wasn't just the idea of being watched. It was the crushing feeling of being utterly alone in a city that felt so alive. Marcos sat on the edge of his bed, his heart racing as he replayed the events of the last few nights in his mind. The shadows danced across his walls, and the low hum of the city outside felt more menacing than soothing. He had contacted the police earlier that evening, his voice shaky as he recounted the strange occurrences that had plagued him since moving into the apartment. Yet their dismissive tone echoed in his ears, leaving him feeling more isolated than ever. "There's no evidence of a crime, sir," one officer had said, sounding bored rather than concerned. "You might just be adjusting to your new surroundings." Adjusting? Marcos scoffed at the word. Nothing about feeling watched or hearing whispers in the walls felt normal. He stood up abruptly, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could fortify his safety. His first step was to reinforce the locks on his door, a task that felt both empowering and futile. He rummaged through his boxes, finally locating a small toolkit. As he tightened the screws on the deadbolt, he muttered to himself, "You can't let this get to you, Marcos. Just a few adjustments, and you'll be fine." Later that evening, with his lock secured, he decided to take another precaution, carrying pepper spray. He had bought it on a whim after hearing the officer's nonchalance. "Better safe than sorry," he murmured, gripping the canister tightly as he tucked it into his pocket. He felt a false sense of security wash over him, but the gnawing anxiety never fully dissipated. As night enveloped the city, the noises returned. A faint scratching echoed through the walls. accompanied by the unsettling feeling that someone was watching him from the shadows. Marcos tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the television, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the figure he had seen outside his window. Maybe tonight will be different, he whispered to himself, as if willing the universe to grant him peace. Just as he was about to crawl into bed, he heard it again, a sound that sent chills down his spine. His breath hitched in his throat as he caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway outside his door. Heart pounding, he peered through the peephole. What he saw made his blood run cold. The man he had seen before, standing just a few feet away, his back turned, seemingly waiting. Panic surged through Marcos as he backed away from the door. "What do you want?" he shouted, though he knew he was alone. There was no answer, just silence. He gripped the pepper spray tighter, feeling the cold metal dig into his palm. Taking a deep breath, he decided to confront the figure. He opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking ominously. "Hey!" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. The figure turned, his features obscured by shadows, but the sense of dread in the pit of Marcos's stomach deepened. Without a word, the man took a step forward, and panic overwhelmed him. Marcos bolted down the hallway, heart racing, adrenaline surging through his veins. He could hear the man's footsteps echoing behind him, each step a reminder of the danger that lurked just out of sight. Running through the building, he turned corners and dashed down the stairs, praying he could outpace his pursuer. "Help, somebody!" he yelled, his voice echoing off the stark walls, but the building was eerily quiet, as if everyone had vanished. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting eerie shadows that danced around him, heightening his sense of urgency. Marcos burst through the lobby doors and into the street, the cool night air hitting him like a splash of cold water. He glanced back, but the man was nowhere in sight. Breathing heavily, he stumbled to a nearby corner, trying to gather his thoughts and figure out his next move. His mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was this man stalking him? Why? Just then his phone buzzed in his pocket, the sound jolting him back to reality. He fumbled to pull it out, his hand shaking. It was a notification from his security camera app. He opened it, and his heart dropped as he saw the footage. There he was, the man, lurking just outside the apartment door, the same cold gaze that had haunted his dreams. "Why is this happening to me?" Marcos whispered, feeling the weight of despair settle on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't stay in the apartment any longer, but where could he go? The walls felt like they were closing in, and the city that once seemed so vibrant now felt like a prison. With a heavy heart, he gathered his thoughts and realized he needed to go to the police again. They had to take him seriously this time. As he turned to head back toward the station, he glanced at the building one last time, a sense of foreboding washing over him. The night was far from over, and the darkness seemed to loom, waiting for him to make his next move. Marcos sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall opposite him. The once vibrant colors of the room seemed dull under the weight of his recent experiences. The police had finally apprehended the man who had turned his life into a waking nightmare. Yet the fleeting relief he felt after the arrest was quickly overshadowed by a growing sense of unease. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence louder, and his thoughts spiraled into a chaotic whirlpool of doubt and fear. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. "I need to get back to normal," he muttered, half-heartedly convincing himself. He picked up his phone, scrolling through the news apps, desperate for a distraction. But the headlines only reminded him of his ordeal, the stalking incidents, the increasing crime rates in the city, and stories of people who had been victims of similar experiences. He tossed the phone aside, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Later that evening, he decided a walk might clear his mind. As he stepped outside, the cool air wrapped around him like a balm, but it did little to ease his anxiety. The streets were bustling with life, people laughing and chatting as they passed him by, oblivious to the turmoil brewing within him. He wandered aimlessly, his thoughts racing. Had he truly been safe now that the stalker was caught? Or was it merely a temporary reprieve? "Hey, Marcos," a voice called out, pulling him from his reverie. It was Luciana, his neighbor. She approached with a warm smile, but something in her eyes made him hesitate. "You look a bit lost," Everything okay? Yeah, just thinking, he replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just trying to adjust, I guess. Luciana studied him for a moment, her brow creasing in concern. You know, it's completely natural to feel off after everything that's happened. If you ever want to talk, I'm just next door. Thanks, Luciana. I appreciate it, Marco said, but her gaze felt too probing, as if she could see through his facade. He turned his head to look at the street, feeling a wave of discomfort wash over him. As days turned into a week, the relief from the police arrest began to fade, replaced by an insidious doubt. Marcos found himself questioning every creak in the building, every whisper of wind that slipped through the cracks. He had installed additional locks, but they felt more like a band-aid over a gaping wound. It was during one of his late-night insomnia episodes that he decided to seek professional help. The therapist's office was cozy, with soft lighting and soothing colors. Dr. Hargrove, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. So, Marcos, what brings you here today? She asked, settling into her chair. I don't know where to start, he admitted, fiddling with his hands. I thought I was safe after they caught the man who stalked me, but I can't shake this feeling that something's not right. It's like I'm constantly on edge. Dr. Hargrove nodded, her expression empathetic. That's understandable. Trauma can have lingering effects, even after the immediate threat is removed. Have you been experiencing any specific symptoms? Marcos hesitated, the memories flooding back. I can't sleep and I feel like I'm being watched all the time. I keep replaying everything in my mind, and it's exhausting. Survivors of stalking often experience anxiety and hypervigilance. It's a way for your mind to protect itself, but it can feel overwhelming, she explained gently. It's important to process what you've gone through. Have you had any contact with the police since the arrest? No, I haven't. I thought I'd just try to move on, he replied. But the words felt hollow. Dr. Hargrove leaned forward, her tone serious. I would recommend you stay in touch with them. Sometimes stalkers have histories of similar behavior. It's vital to understand that you're not alone in this, and there are systems in place to help keep you safe. As he left the session, a chill settled in his bones. The idea that the man who had tormented him was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern, seemed to deepen his trauma. He glanced at the streetlights flickering overhead, shadows dancing along the sidewalk, and felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The sense of safety he had longed for felt as elusive as the shadows that haunted him. Marcos sat on the edge of his bed, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. After the harrowing experience with the stalker, he had hoped for a fresh start. Yet, today, the phone call from the police shattered that fragile sense of peace. The man who had turned his life into a waking nightmare was back on the streets. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs as he tried to stave off the rising panic. With trembling hands, he grabbed his jacket and headed out of his apartment. The hallway felt longer than before, shadows creeping along the walls as if they were alive. He could hear the faint echo of his footsteps, a reminder of the solitude that had enveloped him since the ordeal began. Every creak of the floorboard sent a shiver down his spine, and he quickened his pace. When he reached the ground floor, he pushed through the front door of the building and stepped into the bustling street. The city's vibrant life continued around him, people laughing, cars honking, and street vendors calling out their wares. Yet to Marcos, it felt surreal, as if he were watching the world through a glass wall. His heart raced, and he could feel the prickle of eyes on him, an uncomfortable sensation that had become all too familiar. He arrived at his apartment and was startled to find Luciana leaning against the doorframe, her expression unreadable. "Hey, Marcos," she said, her voice laced with an unsettling calmness. "I was hoping to see you." "Luciana," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you after everything that happened," she said, stepping closer. "I know it's been tough." He felt the tension in the air, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "I appreciate it, but I really need some space right now." "Space? Or maybe you're just scared." Her tone shifted slightly, a hint of something darker lurking beneath her words. "After all, he's out now, isn't he?" Marcos gulped, his heart pounding. "I shouldn't have to be scared in my own home," he snapped, trying to regain control of the conversation. I thought I was safe now. Luciana's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, he saw a flicker of something unsettling, an intensity that made him question everything. Safe? She echoed, her voice dropping to a whisper. You think safety is just a lock on a door or a call to the police? What are you talking about? Marcos asked, confusion flooding his mind. Don't you see, Marcos? You've been so consumed by fear that you haven't noticed what's right in front of you, she said, stepping even closer. There was an unsettling gleam in her eyes, and the warmth of her presence felt suffocating. Luciana, this isn't funny, he said, backing away slightly. I just want to be left alone. But I am here for you, Marcos, she insisted, her voice rising with fervor. I've always been here. I'm the one who understands what you've been through. The realization hit him like a cold wave. Her words wrapped around him like a noose. You knew? He stammered, disbelief coursing through him. You were a part of this? Her smile twisted into something sinister, and in that moment, all the pieces fell into place. I thought I was helping you, she said, her voice dripping with a mix of affection and madness. I orchestrated it all to bring you closer to me. I wanted you to see how much you needed me. Marcos shook his head, horrified. No, this can't be happening, he whispered, backing away until he hit the wall behind him. Don't you understand? She said, her voice a haunting melody. You were never alone. I was always watching, always waiting for the perfect moment to show you just how much I care. As the reality of her confession sank in, Marcos felt the walls of his world closing in on him again. The nightmare he thought he had escaped was only just beginning, and the person he had considered a friend was the architect of his torment. The shadows deepened around him, and as Luciana stepped forward, her intentions clear, he realized he was trapped in a twisted game of obsession and fear, a game he never wanted to play,